My name is Tarian Webb. Welcome to the second seminar of the Gilman Foreign Policy in Focus, Refugees and Migration Virtual Seminar Series. Again, I'm Tarian. I'm one of the co-organizers of the seminar series, which is presented by the Gilman Scholarship, a program of the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, and hosted by the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies and the Center for the Study of Global Change at Indiana University.
Thanks, Tarian, and welcome everyone. My name is Ellie Cohen, and I am the other co-organizer of the seminar series. So thank you to all of you who participated in our session last week. And those of you who were not with us last week but have joined us this week, welcome. We are glad to see you and have you here with us today.
So before we introduce today's seminar and our speakers, we want to just go over a few logistics and housekeeping items. So first, you will notice that we are recording this session. All recordings will be up online on the Gilman Scholarship website and the seminar's digital toolbox, which we will present and introduce to you a little while later. Please note that you will not appear on screen in the recording, even if your camera is on.
Throughout the presentation today, if you have questions either about the series itself or any of the content that we are discussing, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. We're going to do our best to respond to the chat during the seminar. And if we're unable to answer your questions now, we are going to note and collect all of those questions, and we'll send out a seminar Q&A after this session. So you can look for that in your email. If for some reason you didn't receive the Q&A document from last session, which was sent out in a follow-up email, or if you just didn't read it, you can find that link in the chat.
So one thing, we talked about this a little bit last week. We know that it could sometimes be difficult to connect with others in these kind of virtual spaces, but we do try, and we will try over the course of the series, the seminar series, to create opportunities to connect and build community. So as a part of that, we invite you, as you are able and comfortable, to turn your cameras on so that we can see each other and feel a bit more together, a bit more connected.
Yeah, and on those lines, we also encourage you to use the chat, not just for your questions for the speakers, but also as an additional way to communicate with each other.
We also encourage you to close your other windows, to shut down your email, maybe put your phone on silence for a while, and allow yourself, again, as you are able, to take time and be present in this space. There's so many things going on, right, all the time, and we hope that you will use this time as a time to focus on yourself, focus on your learning and your growth. We don't allow ourselves moments to take these kind of respites often enough, I think, and we deserve them every once in a while, and you deserve them now.
Great. And so with that, we're going to turn the microphone over to Dr. Rawan Arar to present our seminar, which is entitled The Global Policies and Politics of Refugee Protection, the Current System and the Path Forward. Dr. Arar is an assistant professor in the Department of Law, Societies, and Justice at the University of Washington. Her research begins with the refugee as a central figure of analysis and takes a sociological approach to explore the ways that refugees' lives and life changes are inextricably tied to national and global policies, which can create or impede access to basic needs, to education, to rights, and to mobility. You can find her full bio in the link that we'll place in the chat momentarily. Dr. Arar will be leading the remainder of the session with this interactive presentation and plenty of time for Q&A.
While you might have heard a different title for the presentation, it's really to capture the same kind of gist or approach. What I wanted to do today is to really give you an overview of global displacement and to also talk about not just the state of displacement in terms of what things look like, but how states and the international system end up shaping movement. So how they end up shaping the ability for people to move, but also limiting their access to movements as well. And before I dive in, I just want to tell you a little bit about who I am as a scholar and a researcher and where these insights that I'll be discussing today come from. I am a sociologist and I teach in a department called Law, Societies, and Justice. I'm very interested in socio-legal issues. So I'm interested in looking at the difference between what law is on the books as opposed to how things play out in people's daily lives. And specifically, I have an interest in thinking about how the legal ways that we talk about refugee issues also end up living within their own realm of knowledge production, as opposed to people's lived experiences, and thinking about how the different interests of various states and various actors shapes refugee issues as well. So most of the time that I have spent in working with and talking to refugees has been in Jordan. I saw several of you have spent time there as well. I'm Palestinian, Jordanian, American, grew up in the US, but have spent my whole life going back and forth between the US and Jordan, which is where most of my extended family lives. With that perspective, have just always been really interested in refugee issues because Jordan has a very large number of refugees and a lot of diverse refugee populations. So this image that you see here in the background of the first screen is actually from my field work right outside of Azraq refugee camp. And I think it captures two things. One, just this beautiful landscape, but two, the remoteness of the camp and the way in which the camp is far outside of, like, let's say the capital, while at the same time it has developed into a city and a social space all unto itself. So let's see, I'll also note that I spent several years conducting over 175 interviews with Syrian refugees, Jordanian officials, UN officials, and NGO officials, and also conducting interviews with Jordanian citizens and residents. So I was really interested in studying just Jordan's response to refugee reception, especially as it relates to state sovereignty and how a state maintains authority over its territory while taking in so many people and at the same time negotiating and working with different international organizations. So that's been really the core of my work. And then from there, I've grown to study global displacement in other parts of the world as well. Again, thinking about the role of different states in the movement of people. And that's what we're really going to be focusing on today. So there's that as an overview. So I like to start off with this image of Yazidi refugees to make the point that refugees, as we talk about them colloquially, might be defined or understood through the challenges that they face in their life, through dispossession and through displacement. However, there's a difference between the colloquial way that we talk about refugees and the legal definition, which is incredibly consequential. So despite how—
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I just jump in here and ask you to describe the photo briefly for people who might not be able to see it?
Sure. This image includes Yazidi refugees. There's a mother holding a small child in her arms with two of her children walking next to her. The children look exhausted, and in the background, out of focus, you can see that there are more people who are also fleeing. So the image that I include here is intended to capture how we might imagine refugees when we're talking about them, right? And the point that I want to make is to juxtapose that image with the legal definition of a refugee that is rooted in the 1951 Refugee Convention. And so on this slide, I've just excerpted a part of the legal definition. So legally, a refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable or unwilling to such fear, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence, is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to return to it. Excuse me for stuttering through that. The point that I want to make here, though, is that refugees are defined in law, and that this definition is very consequential in terms of who is recognized as a refugee. I want to step back and say, this definition is not the end-all description of all people's experiences when they are fleeing violence or persecution. So you might notice there are 5 characteristics that are included here that are used to identify, for courts to identify who refugees are. But there are things that aren't included. So for example, persecution on the basis of sex or sexuality is not included in this definition. So it's important to note that this definition was agreed upon by states. So it came to being because states negotiated it, right? It becomes very consequential in our understanding of refugee displacement more broadly. I'm sorry, I'm seeing messages here in the chat. Oh, is that not to me, Ellie? Okay, I'm just going to ignore that. Sorry for that.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. I'm just going to X out of this chat and you let me know, interrupt me if there's anything you need. Right?
I won't.
Okay, let's get back to it. So the point is, I'm going to step back here and say there's a colloquial definition, there's a legal definition, both are consequential. Okay, the legal definition is not only tied to the kind of persecution or violence that a person has experienced, but they have to be outside of the country where they usually live. They have to cross a state border. And so with this image of a man handing a baby from underneath a barbed wire fence at the Hungarian-Serbian border, I want to make the point that refugees have to cross a state border. What that means is that the same barrel bomb can fall in the same cul-de-sac, and in one family, let's say we're talking about Syrian experiences in Daraa, and one family runs towards inside the state and another family runs towards the outside of the state. Those who cross the state border are refugees, and those who stay inside would be considered internally displaced. That's really important because it ends up changing what kind of access to rights, resources, and international support they might be able to get, right? So again, the definition is different from the experience. And so within that context, keeping in mind that this legal definition is incredibly important, there are all these different titles that we ascribe onto people who are forcibly displaced. And so the UNHCR, which is the main UN refugee agency, each year provides a global trends report that gives us a bird's eye view of global displacement. And I'm going to continuously draw on that throughout this presentation. But if you're interested, I would highly recommend that you go check this out. And then we can also talk in the Q&A about what you'll find versus where you might need to supplement it with other resources as well. We'll get into that. So if we go back to thinking about refugee displacement from the largest bird's eye view, according to the UN, there are almost 90 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. Of those 89.3 million, 27.1 million are refugees, meaning they meet that definition, they've crossed a state border. And then within that refugee population, we have another group that is not supported by the UNHCR, which is the main UN refugee agency, and that's Palestinians. So Palestinians in 5 different territories and states are make up about 20% of all refugees worldwide, but they are not under the mandate of the UNHCR. Now, you might be thinking, why do I need to know all these things? Well, that actually is important because that means that the different institutions end up shaping what their experiences are and what their opportunities are when it comes to movement and access to resources. It shapes how the money, the global investments, let's say, or global support comes through different institutions to support different refugee populations. So already what you've learned is that definitions matter, institutions matter, and that there are all different kinds of people in this world who are forcibly displaced, and that they are governed in different ways depending on what kind of labels are ascribed onto them. So we have about 27.1 million refugees in the world, 21.3 million fall within the mandate of the UNHCR. This is the latest data that we have from the Global Trends Report. I bet you the next one will be coming out soon, and it does not include Ukrainian refugees. So the most recent statistics that I've heard are going to take us over 100 million people. The vast majority of people who are forcibly displaced actually haven't crossed a state border. So if we remember that the image that I just showed you of a man handing a baby from underneath a barbed wire fence to emphasize the importance of borders, it's important to note that most of these people are actually, most of the world's forcibly displaced people are actually internally displaced. Then we have another category, which is asylum seekers. Now, one thing to take away from this conversation is what's the difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee? This graph states that there are 4.6 million asylum seekers. Asylum seekers are people who are seeking asylum. So they are seeking refugee status. And that is really important because that really also brings in the kinds of states that have to adjudicate whether someone is a refugee or not. And we will get into that moving on in the conversation. And then finally, here we have 4.4 million Venezuelans displaced abroad. Now, if you'll allow me to go backwards to this legal definition, as you will see, we have that people who will qualify for the refugee recognition have to have been persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. So what that means is that people who experience economic deprivation and are displaced because of that are not recognized today as refugees. And that's why it says 4.4 million Venezuelans displaced abroad, as opposed to calling them refugees in the Global Trends Report. So that also, I mean, I don't know if some of you who are tuning in know about what Venezuelans have experienced, but we can, there can be an argument that is made for the fact that these people have experienced violence as well. And so this becomes a controversial assessment, essentially, about who is considered a refugee and who isn't. So here I feel like I've given you a lot to think about and a lot of terms that we'll continue to talk about in this presentation and probably throughout your entire seminar series. Okay. Next, I want to make the point that when we're thinking about these 27.1 million refugees, they're not equally distributed around the whole world. Most refugees come from countries in the global south, and they flee to countries in the global south. So this is a distorted map that takes land sizes and blows them up depending on countries of origin, where refugees are coming from, and countries of destination. And the point that it's making here is that when we are talking about refugee displacement and reception, we are often put in a position to think about reception in the global South. And so global South is a term that means like developing countries or I guess third world countries, depending on who you're in conversation with and how you're discussing this. Moving forward, I'm going to talk about the differences between the experiences of refugees in different parts of the world. But when you look at this map, what I want you to think about is how does displacement from a specific place and to a specific place, especially in the global South or in a developing country, end up shaping people's access to rights and resources, and how that movement is controlled. And I'd like to make the point here that this distorted map, this distribution of the world's refugees, this is not just an accident of geography. Although it's true that most people end up fleeing across state borders, there is also a system in place that is intended to contain refugees in the global South. And this has been called a grand compromise. So here I quickly describe what the Grand Compromise is on screen next to the map that I just showed. So there is a system of global refugee management in which states in the global South host most of the world's refugees and states in the global North finance refugee hosting abroad. Okay, enter money. So now we are talking money, we are talking geography, we are talking different legal labels, and we are talking the global distribution of the world's refugees. So you're working with all these things now to end up trying to make sense of the state of global displacement around the world. So this grand compromise means that states donate specifically through the UNHCR, and that money not only goes to provide humanitarian aid, but to also achieve other state goals that end up intersecting with limiting the migration and mobility of refugees. Here's another map that comes from Global Trends, and it includes a map of the world and blue and red circles to indicate where people live. It just provides more nuance than the bloated map I showed you a moment ago. It reads refugees, people in refugee-like situations, and Venezuelans displaced abroad. And this is statistics through the end of 2021. So again, you can kind of see, depending on the size of the circle, where most of the world's refugees live, and you'll see Turkey, Pakistan, Germany, Sudan, Uganda have these big circles. And then for the Venezuelans displaced abroad, you'll see an indication of refugees in Colombia, in Peru, in Chile, right? Notice the smaller circles in Canada and the US. And so again, I'm still here trying to provide you context of the state of global displacement. So when we're thinking about refugee movement, so far we've been talking about the refugees themselves, but we also want to think about hosts. So who's hosting refugees, and how do the interests of hosts end up shaping refugees' experiences and what we know about refugees. So 83% of refugees are hosted in these low and middle income countries. This number, the statistic is going to change very soon because of Ukrainian displacement. So according to the UN, more than 8 million Ukrainians became refugees in 2022. And I've done the calculations again on my own, so they're not precise or exact, but we're still looking at something like 76% of refugees in the global South, despite this huge influx of refugees in Europe and the global North. And 72% are hosted in neighboring countries. So again, we're talking about crossing across a state border. Here you see that the primary hosts are Turkey with 3.8 million refugees. And then if you include the asylum seekers in this number too, it'll get you to 4 million. Colombia, Uganda, Pakistan, and Germany. And here, oh, I'm so excited to make this point for you. Remember I told you that I would like you to read Global Trends and think of it carefully, and then I want you to supplement it with other contexts. So let's just step back for a moment and make the point that Global Trends is produced by the UNHCR, by the leading refugee humanitarian response, let's say, initiative, right? The leading organization. And so they're also producing a lot of the knowledge that we use. They shape how we think about refugees. They shape what we know about refugees. And in doing so, they have that imperative. And at the same time, they also have a political imperative. They're not neutral scholars who, are learning some things and sharing them with a group of students on Zoom on a Thursday. It's Thursday, right? But they have a role to play. And so what you don't see here on the list of hosts are territories that aren't recognized as states. So for example, Gaza is not included here, despite the fact that Gaza has something like 2 million refugees on its population that are recognized by the UN. Kurdistan is not included here because Kurdistan is not a state. It's treated as a non-sovereign territory in these other states, right? So while you're learning about this overview, I also want you to recognize that there are things that are missing and that the knowledge that we receive is shaped by the politics of the world, right? And so then we'll move on to think about places that have a high proportion of refugees. And that's what this 1 in 6 are displaced in Aruba, Lebanon, Curacao, Jordan, and Turkey. So here we're thinking about proportion. As you're developing this overview in your mind of refugee issues, let's step back and think about why this is important to begin with. So if we're thinking about actual numbers versus percentage of the population, that becomes really important politically. So if you have a small country with a smaller population, but you still have a large number of refugees, it might be that refugees become, 1 in 6 or 1 in 8. It's also important to note here who is included as a refugee, right? So in this, let's say, percentage focused perspective, we aren't seeing people who aren't recognized by the UN, and specifically we aren't seeing Palestinians either here. So in Jordan, where I work, where I know some of you have visited, we have something like 3 million registered refugees in a population of about 10 million people, right? So that percentage is much higher than 1 in 14. So again, this is an overview, but it's an overview that is shaped by politics that ends up informing our what we know about refugees. And so our job as scholars is to learn about this, to understand how it shapes what people know, but also to bring a critical lens to learning this information. And so now that we've established all these different ways in which people who are forcibly displaced are described, now that we understand the global distribution of the world's refugees, let's think about how the UN has spearheaded solutions for refugees. What is the solution to displacement? So the UNHCR promotes 3 durable solutions. If you were taking an exam, this would be on the test, okay? The question is, what are the UNHCR's durable solutions? There are 3 durable solutions. We have voluntary return. So people go home because now the conflict is over. There's no threat in the same way. 5 million displaced people returned here, and this number includes internally displaced, right? So if we're looking at refugees, we have 429,300 refugees have returned, okay? And this is 2022 statistics, meaning that it reflects 2021, what was happening in 2021. Okay, but keep in mind the overall number of the world's refugees, right? So this is a very small percentage of people. Then we have, so voluntary return, that is clear what that is, right? Resettlement. Resettlement is a process through which refugees are vetted, selected, and then invited to enter other countries. So in 2021, 57,500 refugees were resettled. So this would be like refugees coming to the United States. They go through a long process, they're vetted, and then they come to the United States. This is not asylum seekers. That's why that category is also really important to note, because we're talking about different people's experiences. The third durable solution is local integration. but we don't actually have a number for how many people are locally integrated. And the point to make here, especially if you are interested in some kind of humanitarian intervention, let's say that's what work you want to do in the future, is voluntary return. You can count the number of people who return. Resettlement, you can count the number of people who are resettled. But local integration is a process. It's not a movement. So you can't actually count the number of people who cross a border. And so if you're interested in talking about the process of local integration, we can do that in the Q&A as well. So to summarize the takeaway here, if you only take one thing from this slide, it is to know that there are 3 durable solutions that the UNHCR promotes for the world's refugees. Now we're on a slide that has a chart that will describe the state interests from thinking about how and why states respond differently to refugee populations. So here, the title of this chart is Differences Between States of Refugee Resettlement and Major Refugee Host States. So states of refugee resettlement, they change every year, but we have, let's say, around 27 to low 30s states of refugee resettlement. The US has been a primary state of refugee resettlement. That means these are countries in the global north, usually, that vet and select refugees. Meanwhile, major refugee host states are usually in the global south. So if you remember that loaded map that I showed you, there we're thinking mostly states of major refugee host states. Now, what's the difference? And again, if we're trying to create the scaffolding in our mind to understand global movement, what is the difference when it comes to receiving refugees in the global north versus receiving refugees in the global south? And I will make a quick caveat here to say I'm not talking about asylum seekers, which we can get to later as well. So we're just talking about resettled refugees. First of all, there is a demographic difference. So states of refugee resettlement in the global north, they can control the number of refugees. Meanwhile, states in the global south, like Jordan, where I do most of my work, they have seemingly uncontrolled numbers, or they seem limitless. And so to make this point stronger, here I have a graph that shows you the annual refugee admission ceiling in the United States versus the actual number of refugees from fiscal years 2001 through 2018. The point here, the blue line shows the refugee ceiling that is set by Congress. Meanwhile, the orange line shows the actual arrivals. And you can see throughout that sometimes the blue line is higher than the orange line, meaning that the ceiling is set higher than the number of refugees who actually come. The point that I want you to take from this graph is that states of refugee resettlement can control the number of refugees accepted to the state. Not only that, they can control where they come from. Look at how much state control is involved in this. So resettled refugees from, or this bar graph, series of bar graphs shows you resettled refugees from Somalia, Syria, and Iran for fiscal years 2016, 2017, and 2018. And as you'll see here, that the number of Somali refugees went from 2016, that was 9,020 people, to 257 people in 2018. For Syrians, we went from over 12,000 people in 2016 to 62 resettled refugees in 2018. And for Iranians, we go from almost 4,000 refugees who are resettled to 41. So if you were in my class, I would have you thinking about the power of a state that can engage in resettlement, because not only do they control the numbers, they can control where refugees come from. And pop quiz, what happened around this year? Why do we see these numbers plummeting, right? So this would have been in response to the executive order about limiting movement from primarily Muslim countries, right? So what's really interesting about that executive order is if you look at that list and then you compare it to global trends, that was also not just a Muslim ban, it was a ban on refugees as well. So essentially the numbers there plummeted. Refugees who are resettled, as I mentioned earlier, they go through this entire journey before they're allowed to enter places like the United States, Canada, or the UK. And so this, let's say, chart walks you through what that process looks like. And I just want to make the point here. Let's see, I suppose I will read it for those who cannot easily see this. So people start by fleeing their country, and they end up finding safety in neighboring states. Then they apply as refugees, and the UNHCR determines which durable solution might apply for them. And if they're eligible to be resettled, then they end up waiting and being processed. And here it talks about how the average wait time for refugees in states in the global south can be 10 to 26 years, depending on which population we're talking about. The refugee families undergo interviews to essentially be vetted. Then they have to go through medical examinations. Then they have to be approved, and they receive a cultural orientation before they're allowed to enter the United States. And then the approved families come to the US. So again, the point of including this is to show you how much state control is involved in receiving resettled refugees. Now I'm bringing you back to that chart from the beginning. So the point that I've made so far is that states in the global north, they can control their numbers. And by controlling their numbers, they can also engage in rigorous security checks. So they can also engage in screening and selection. That's very different than states that share a border that are taking in thousands of people per day. They have a more lax selection mechanism, and therefore diminished ability to screen for security related concerns. But there's a caveat there that we can talk about later, essentially engaging in more draconian practices or containment that ends up allowing them to do such checks. States in the global north, states of refugee resettlement, their borders are strictly controlled. Meanwhile, the borders for states in the global south tend to be more porous. And then now I want you to logically think through this. So if we control the numbers and we can do security checks and the borders are strictly controlled, that means that there's a minimal reliance on the UNHCR. The reason that is very interesting and important is that that allows the state to essentially control the entire response to refugee displacement without having to turn to the UN to get the support they need. But if you have hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million refugees, the UN becomes essential for the refugee response. And now the state that's hosting that population needs to coordinate with the UN in order to be able to respond to refugees' needs, and also just the extreme emergency that now exists in the country. And so next, I want to make the point with this aerial image of Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya, that refugee hosting, it's not temporary, right? So if we think about this from the perspective of a state, this is a responsibility that the state takes on for decades usually. So if you remember in the flow chart, we saw that refugees end up waiting 10 to 26 years for a resettlement. Well, oftentimes refugees have been displaced for generations and people are born in refugee camps. And so, and they live their lives out there. So the point is that when we're thinking about that chart and we're thinking about that comparison, it's really important to recognize that we're not talking about temporary displacement, even though oftentimes that's what the language around this is. And so that point is reiterated going back to this chart when we think about how resettled refugees, they have a pathway to citizenship. But those who are not resettled and are living in the global south often never have a pathway to citizenship, and instead they have to depend on human rights. Okay, now if I was in a classroom with you all, I would ask you, why does that matter? Why is that interesting? Okay, you get citizenship, you become part of the polity. Your kids are likely going to get citizenship too. You can pass that on. That in some ways ends the cycle of refugeehood. Now, if you have to depend on human rights, there is no state to back that up. So your human rights are rhetorical. And what's going to happen to your kids? How long will you be displaced? How long will you be without rights? And that becomes a really central and important question when we're comparing and trying to understand the global state of displacement. Here I have an image of refugees in Zaatari camp, which is where I've done much of my field work. Zaatari became one of the most photographed camps in the world. And these images, I personally think that they're very beautiful, right? We have a very busy street, one of the main streets in the camp that has several shops. We have two children, a little girl who's hugging, who I'm thinking is her brother, in diapers with a blurred background. We have that same busy street during the day. You can see the markets. We have a welcome sign that says, "Welcome to Zaatari Refugee Camp," and points that this is the Mafraq Governorate. We have a man who's about to get a haircut here. So I'm showing you that there are businesses happening. And then you see the tents in the early days of Zaatari. So they go from tents to caravans. The point to reinforce here is that while people might have their basic resources, right? They might have access to getting a haircut, access to some pizza, access to a phone line. They don't have a pathway to citizenship. So they don't have access to full legal incorporation. So here I included the map again to reinforce most refugees, or this bloated map, to reinforce that most refugees, they come from countries in the global south and they are hosted in countries in the global south. Now, what happened in 2015 that changed or challenged this global distribution of the world's refugees? So in 2015, we end up with more than 1 million refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers coming to the shores of Europe. This really rattled the global distribution that I'm describing. And it was an opportunity to potentially change the stakes. So here I've argued that Syrian refugees, they had this chance to change the stakes of the global refugee assistance regime. And what ended up happening is that major refugee host states in the global south, especially those that were hosting Syrians, were able to leverage the refugee hosting capacity and renegotiate policies that supported state-centric agendas. So with this point, and bringing you back to this graph, I want you to understand that there's all this politics at play. There are a lot of state interests here. So if you're a state in the global north, let's think the United States, and you want to be able to control refugee movement, versus if you are a state like Jordan and you have a lot of refugees and you could potentially control their movement, then states in the global north are going to invest in your containment capacity, your response to, or your potential to contain and respond to refugees. I just want you to see the politics here, right? So when over 1 million migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers made it to Europe, there was this huge pushback. States did not know how to respond. So here is an image with many people going down the Baltic route, and you can see just a line of people, a crowd as far as the eye can see. And I included this notorious image of a Hungarian camera woman who was caught kicking and tripping refugees as they were fleeing. The point is that there was a lot of negative sentiment, right, about this refugee response. So much so, they were so invested in refugee containment in this period that states were doing some really incredible things to try to keep refugees away. And so here I have an ad that Denmark took out in Arabic to discourage potential asylum seekers from leaving Lebanon, okay? So this ad states that don't come to Denmark because social assistance for newly arrived refugees was going to be reduced by 50%. So again, thinking that refugees are coming for a greater chance of getting the support that they might need in terms of financial support. So Denmark is saying, don't come, we're gonna reduce the money. Those granted temporary protection would not have the right to family reunification for the first year of their residence. So they're also saying, you can't bring your family over, you don't wanna come. New refugees will have to be able to speak and understand Danish in order to obtain permanent residency. So also a big ask, right? If you're thinking about elderly refugees, if you're thinking about people who are fleeing war, now you're also asking them you're letting them know that they must be able to fully integrate by learning the language. And so that's being used as a deterrence mechanism. Okay, here's a state in the global north, just to emphasize this comparison between global south and global north. Here are images that were taken out of an Australian graphic novel that was produced to discourage asylum seekers. And I've taken several images from this graphic novel. The first at the top left has a young man. It looks like he is from Afghanistan or Pakistan, and he is dreaming about what his life in Australia might be like. So that's what's in the thought bubble. So you can see that he is working on a car. It's showing what his life is like. He is living a difficult life is what the image is trying to convey, and that he is dreaming about resettlement. And then it goes on to show, if we look at the images on the right, that asylum seekers, so, okay, love it. Now we're going back to that first description. We talked about resettled refugees, but here are asylum seekers who are not being vetted, selected, and invited. These are people who crossed the Mediterranean. I want you to think about people who crossed the Mediterranean to then seek asylum. So he's saying this image is saying you might think that your life in Australia is going to be great, but actually when you come, you're going to be subjected to detention. So that's what these tents are supposed to show. So you're not going to be living this beautiful life that you imagine. And instead you're going to be here. You're not going to feel good. You see him grabbing his face because he has a toothache. You see the mosquitoes that are biting his skin, and that you are going to sit here and you are going to imagine how good life was back home. And that's what the thought bubble is capturing here. So the point is that this graphic novel was created also like the ad that was taken out by Denmark to discourage asylum seekers from coming, to discourage people from coming. Another way in which we see states were invested in upholding this status quo between major host states in the global south and states in the global north that are more able to control their migration is how the money, if we follow the money, right, was spent. And so here you have a graph that includes both line charts and a bar graph. The title of the graph is Top Donor States to the UNHCR in 2016 and percent change between consecutive years. 2016 is important because 2015 is when over 1 million asylum seekers, refugees, migrants came to Europe. And so we see that the primary top hosts were the US, the EU, and Germany. The line graph shows the actual dollar amount. So you can see that the US is by far the greatest donor to the UNHCR. The bar graph, however, shows the percent change. And so you can see that the percent change for Germany, right, or for the EU or for the US actually increased substantially, with Germany being more than 150% in terms of donating money to states. Because again, humanitarianism and the humanitarian response is directly tied to immigration control as well, right? So the proof that I've shown you that states are interested in supporting and maintaining the global distribution of the world's refugees is through that ad, is through the graphic novel, and now is through following the money, right? And here I wanted to show you just a quick screenshot of who the top donors are for the UNHCR. So you see that the United States is a top donor in 2022, Germany, the EU, Japan, and Sweden. Okay, so far we have been focused mostly on the perspective of states, thinking about the UN as a global institution that works as a liaison between states to manage the flow of refugees while also providing aid for them. But in my most recent scholarship, in a book that was published with David Fitzgerald, we put forth something that we're calling a systems approach to study refugee displacement. So we're interested in thinking about how all these things are connected and how in seeing their connections, we learn new things about politics. For today's presentation, I want to use part of the book to explain to you refugees as perspectives on these things as well, right? So far we've talked about states and state interests, but where do the people fit in? And so a systems approach shows how outputs of a process become new inputs. So as states are changing their policies, and as things are developing in different ways, there are new responses to those. And here I just have an image to capture the idea of a systems approach, which is this loop that shows people walking on either side of it, which is to make the points that the global north and global south are connected. A systems approach shows how refugeehood, the experience of becoming a refugee, interacts with refugeedom, the relationship between refugees, states, and society. So notice here that refugeehood is different than that legal definition that we started off with. So this provides us with the language and the ability to think and theorize about the lived experience of being a refugee. And that is more expansive than the legal definition that states and lawyers have to use in order to adjudicate, who can get that recognition. And I am now going to show you this mobility immobility chessboard that we introduce in the book. But before I do that, I want to frame it within the context of a conversation that I'm sure you are all aware of. So that is this binary between refugee versus economic migrant. And so if we think back to that legal definition, it's important to note that if you can meet that definition, you get access to territory, to rights, to opportunities that people who do not meet that definition can't get. Refugees are considered a special category legally. And so that binary between refugee versus economic migrant becomes a really important distinction for states when people are deciding who to give that right to. Now that is in the legal world, right? But in real life, people's lives are way more complicated than that. And so with this chart, I want to essentially blow up that binary and just think about all the different degrees of movement. And so here you see the scaffolding of this chart. We have degree of coercion, thinking from low to high. And we also have degree of movement, again, thinking from low to high. And I've filled this chart with a matrix. So you can see that there are all these different boxes that I'm going to fill in with different definitions of people who have experienced movement or coercion. The first two columns I've reserved here for domestic movement. So moving inside the state, think about those IDPs I was telling you about. So these are people who haven't crossed the state border. The second two columns capture international movement. And so this is crossing a state border. And then the third column is reserved for international return. So international return is conceptualized as the greatest degree of movement. In the bottom left square, here I have a voluntary non-migrant. That's a lot of words to say a person who hasn't moved. Most of the world's population includes voluntary non-migrants, people who have not moved. So then I'm filling in squares as they move across the, let's say, degrees of movement here. So you have an internal migrant. So this is not somebody who is coerced, but they've moved internally. You have an authorized migrant. This is someone who has, let's say, has a visa and is able to cross a border. And then you have an unauthorized migrant. So that moves us up a little bit in terms of coercion, but still the same degree of movement. Now, for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to go quickly through these boxes, but we can talk more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. Next, I've filled out the first column to show the lowest degree of movement, but the highest degree of coercion. And here, the highest degree of coercion would essentially being killed at home. And in this book, the point is to bring in conflict studies when we're talking about refugee displacement, because the legal definition includes having to cross a state border, but to cross a state border, you essentially have to be alive. And so it ends up leaving out a whole bunch of people who've been experiencing violence at its most extreme point within the way that we conceptualize people's experiences of displacement and war. Now I'm filling out boxes that capture what is usually thought about in terms of refugee studies. So we have internal displacement, which is a bit more movement, a bit more coercion. These are the IDPs that we were talking about. Then we have people who are living in open refugee camps like Zaatari that I showed you. So these are people who are in camps, but they can come and go. But still, people who are experiencing more coercion are in closed refugee camps. So there are camps like asylum detention centers where you can't really leave. And then in terms of refugees, we have resettled refugees who you know about, who we talked about. Those are those who are vetted, selected, and invited. So they have a larger degree of movement, but asylees, people who've been given asylum, they have less coercion because essentially they've now been already vetted, selected, and invited, right? In terms of the furthest degree of movement is return. So there are people who have been deported or forced to return, and they experience more coercion than those who voluntarily return. And then throughout this approach to thinking about displacement, we have to continuously think about who within the networks of refugees has essentially died or killed or been killed. So we talked about those who were killed at home in terms of the highest degree of coercion, lowest degree of movement, but there are also people that we need to think about when considering this system and how it operates, because there are people who are killed in transit, there are people who are killed crossing a border, and there are people who are killed upon return. And this becomes really important for thinking about the experience of fleeing war and persecution and what becomes a part of that. On this graph, we've also created space for people who are imprisoned or internally relocated and unable to move. So this is still inside the state, but with a high degree of coercion. And we've also kept space to think about other forms of forced migration. So people who are enslaved, so transported slaves, or people who are indentured servants. So that's a lot here. But what I want you to do is, at the very least, recognize, look how expansive this is beyond the economic refugee versus, economic migrant versus refugee. I'm about to take it to the next level. So now I want you to think not about an individual, but as a family. So if we think about displacement, and we want to think about people's lived experiences to put them in conversation with this global distribution of the world's refugees, what happens when we pivot from thinking about the experience of displacement for an individual to the experience of a family? In the book, we call this the new economics of displacement. And we think about how people as families, they manage risks as households to their physical and economic needs. And in the book, we expand on the Asfour family. This family is from Daraa in Syria, where the war started in 2011. Half of the family, as of the writing of the book, was still in Syria, couldn't leave, and the other half had made it out. So most of them ended up in Jordan, with 2 members of the family now in Canada. And the star indicates the primary interviewee who I talked to, although I talked to several members of the family to learn about their experience. Now, with the last couple minutes that I have here in this presentation, let's map that family onto this chart. Now, before I dive into this, I just want you to think about how this breaks down our thoughts and ideas about deservingness, worthiness, our assumptions about who people are, depending on where they live and how we think about them. And how this breaks down the legal categories, the policy-informed categories. So let's start with Wajih, right? Wajih, he starts off, let's say 2010, he is a voluntary non-migrant. He is a young man, loves to play soccer, hanging out at home. The war starts, he becomes internally displaced with his family. So now he's moving categories. Then he ends up crossing a state border, living in an open refugee camp in Zaatari. He becomes a resettled refugee, and very recently, was able to gain citizenship and become an authorized immigrant. So just by mapping his movement across this chart, we can see how these categories can be expanded and connected in all of these ways that we don't usually think about. Now, Wajih is part of a family. He has family that is still in Zatari in an open refugee camp. He has a brother who was recently resettled as a refugee. He has family that's still internally displaced in Syria. For a while, he had a father who was in a besieged territory under ISIS control. He has a brother who was thinking about seeking asylum, essentially one of those people who in the media is portrayed as someone who's greedy and trying to get access to these greater resources. This is the person who Denmark would take an ad against and tell them, no, don't come here, right? That's his brother who's just trying to find a better way because he didn't have the same opportunity to be resettled. And then we have a sister who was killed at home. So when we move from the individual level of analysis to the family unit of analysis, we can see how these categories actually play out in people's lived experiences. And I will say from my own experience of talking to refugees and comparing what I've learned from them to what I've read from the knowledge that is produced by states or humanitarian organizations, or even scholars, is when a person is trying to navigate these challenges of displacement, of course, they're thinking about borders and policies and what kind of resources they have access to, but they're also thinking about their families. They're always thinking about their families. And this is, again, I must throw out the caveat that, not all families are healthy, families are complicated. There's a lot of trauma in the family as well. But I say that because I think that this focus on the individual oftentimes excludes this really important imperative for people who are trying to navigate this global system of refugee management. And with that, I thank you so much for your attention. I know it's really hard to pay attention to a person on Zoom that is, talking about so many different things. I included my co-author, David Fitzgerald, here in case you want to follow both of us on Twitter and learn all you can about refugees, which is, something I love to do. And if you want to pull your phone out or follow this QR code, you can have access to the first chapter of the book, which will describe the systems approach that I talked about and really give you a solid understanding of how states across the world are connected in controlling and managing the movement of refugees.